So she should be able to get in now.
Okay, I just sent her an email telling her to try again now that you've started it.
Cool. All right, we're almost there. All right, well, it is 9 a.m. Eastern, so we're gonna go ahead and get started. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay, cool. So I am your CrimCon host. My name is Bree Beaupre. I'm an assistant professor at Wichita State University, and I'm also a board member for CrimCon. And so the way that this works is we will proceed in the order of the conference program. Each presenter will have 10 minutes on the dot. And if you have questions, please type them in the Q&A box and we will answer, or I'm sorry, the panelists will answer all Q&A at the end. And so if you're in the audience, this is what it should look like on your end. So again, be sure to use the Q&A box if you have any questions, and let's have fun. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and then the first panelist is going to share theirs.
Hang on. Am I sharing my screen? Where?
I see like photos.
Okay, well, let's take those down.
Spotify, I like that.
Yeah, I got to listen to some music while we're doing this.
Love it.
Okay, let's see. Okay.
Yeah, it's
Can you see that? Okay.
Yep.
Hi, thanks everyone for joining today. We'll be the first one. I've also turned on the dictation here, just in case anyone might need a little bit more help with hearing it or something along those lines. So today it's the first session and we'll be talking about my colleagues who are on the panelists as well. Mary Weston, who is a prosecutor heading up the ODNA project in Cuyahoga County, and Joanna, who's also on, she is the research assistant working at Case Western Reserve University on the project as well, my colleague there. So we'll go ahead and get started. Here's the disclaimer as the funding source. So in 2016, Cuyahoga County was the first site to be awarded a ODNA award through the Bureau of Justice Assistance's Sexual Assault Kit Initiative. It was the first year in 2016 that they started this aspect of, or purpose area under SAK. And the purpose of ODNA is OD here, meaning that someone should have been lawfully collected or swabbed for their DNA, should have been lawfully collected, and they were not. And so these individuals, based upon each state's laws around swabbing of DNA, ODNA, we knew in Cuyahoga County that there were some big misses that as part of the Sexual Assault Kit Initiative of testing backlog rape kits in Cuyahoga County, we knew that there were a couple of people who should have been swabbed and were not swabbed that were part of the Sexual Assault Kit Initiative, and that they were connected to DNA, they were connected by DNA to backlogged rape kits. Larry McGowan was one of the individuals who should have been swabbed but was not. And he later went on to rape somebody else in another jurisdiction, swabbed him as part of that. And then he became a named offender in the Cuyahoga County Sexual Assault Kit Initiative. George Young was also the first indicted John Doe, meaning they didn't know who he was, but his profile was in 2 rape kits that had linked to each other. He was arrested for a subsequent offense and actually was missed in part of those until he was sentenced for a prison sentence for that, and then got swabbed in prison, and then he became a named offender at that point. So when we applied in 2016, we knew our jurisdiction had some issues around swabbing individuals, and in particular individuals connected to rape kits. So luckily, as a part of the Sexual Assault Kit Initiative's ODNA initiative, we were able to get an award to address this in our county. So we first conducted a census, which is a list of all individuals who owe DNA and should be in CODIS but are not. So we created this list from 2 parts based primarily on the changes in the laws and over time. So when DNA collection laws were first passed in Ohio, it was at conviction. They changed in effective July 2011 to be at a qualifying offense, which is primarily felonies. So we put those 2 together to see who should have been swabbed but was not. And we came up with a number, 15,370 individuals within this time frame who we have confirmed to have owed DNA. And so they should have been swabbed based upon an offense in their criminal history. But according to the CODIS administrator for the state, they were not in CODIS. Through a series of several years, a 3-year grant, we were able to identify who owed and then follow them as part of the process. And so here's a summary of the work that we did. The Cuyahoga County was the one that was really looking and tracking many of these individuals. And on the researcher side, we were helping with database stuff and also helping track these individuals through the system. So the first thing we needed to do was make sure that they had samples collected, submit them for testing, and then follow up to see, once they were put into CODIS, which is the federal DNA database, what happened with them. We were able, of the 15,000 or so, we were able to confirm that 15% in our 3-year observation period had now been put into CODIS, primarily through new offenses, but through other ways as well. And of those, we received 85 forensic hits to crimes connected to those approximately 2,300 individuals. And you can see here that the crimes that they were most often associated with these 85 forensic hits. And then you can kind of see here some of these main outcomes. We were the first site to do this, so we really didn't know how many hits, how many people would be able to, we certainly didn't think there would be 15,000 people. We didn't think we would have, didn't really know what we would get. And we have really surprised by the number of people who we've been able to confirm as well as get hits connected to them. Here's one brief story of one individual who was identified as part of this, Antonio Huffman, who raped a 17-year-old girl in 1997. He went on to be arrested for a 2012 offense and a 2015. Neither one of those, he was swabbed when he should have been. Then when they tested the kids, they identified him as John Doe 124, but didn't know who he was. As part of our census and as a direct result of our efforts to collect ODNA, he then in 2017 becomes from John Doe 124 to Antonio Huffman, and it ends up being prosecuted for this rape of the 17-year-old girl. We have many more details about this project in our final report, and here's the sort of handle that we have here of where to find the report through a digital scholarship library at CASE. If you have any, this is 10 minutes, so we had to do very high level. Here's the individuals and our contact information if you have questions about the ODNA project. How did I do for time?
Perfect.
Okay, perfect. But now I'm on the wrong camera, hang on. Sorry.
You're good.
I just presented. How did the settings change within one presentation? Okay, Angela, hopefully you'll be able to join us. I wanted to, this presentation is based upon a collaboration between the FBI, the SAK, and Cuyahoga County. So we were, and I want to introduce Angela Williamson, who's trying to be able to talk on the presentation. And she has to call in. And then Tom Dover, who's also on the panel. But we also had co-authors that aren't necessarily on today because there can only be so many people in 10 minutes. This is based upon an article that we collaborated and wrote for that has now come out this summer. It came out with the Law Enforcement Bulletin, which is the FBI's journal. And it's really trying to get at what are all the kind of things that we're learning about SAK and what are the recommendations specifically to law enforcement. So I think what's really unique here is that it is this sort of collaboration between the FBI, SAK, and researchers to kind of come together and see how different jurisdictions and different folks might be able to pull information and what they're learning, not just in one site, but across all the sites. So here's the disclaimer. This is specifically to the grant that we have with the Cuyahoga County Prosecutor's Office around SAK. Angela, are you on yet?
I don't see it.
Okay.
I'm not seeing her on. She says that the call information was sent to her email, so she's guessing it was her full name that was used, but I'm not seeing that.
Yeah, I don't see it either.
Okay. I'm so sorry. Should I go ahead and continue on, do you think?
I think, yeah, if you can, then sure. The parts that Angela would talk to, I can kind of pick up if I have anything to add. If not, then we'll just mention that this is something that Angela would be the best person to answer, and maybe that can be something from an offline conversation.
Yeah, that would be wonderful because, I mean, Tom, Angela, and I did practice this, so we kind of have a sense of what Angela might say, although we certainly aren't replacements for Angela. Don't want to step on her toes, but we'll go ahead for time's sake and just move forward so we don't take over other people's time. So here are the recommendations that we have for investigating sexually motivated violent crimes. One of the most unique things I think about this jurisdiction, or about SAK, is that it really provides us data, and given that we're researchers, we wanted to really emphasize this, that it's really, why are we getting this different view? Why is SAK telling us things and changing how we view sexual offenders? The reason is really we've never had data like these before. So here's a map of all the different SAK sites over time, and SAK meaning Sexual Assault Kit Initiative. Some are jurisdictions, cities, counties, like one that I'm in, Cuyahoga County, and some are states. Some are rural districts, some are suburban districts, a few maybe suburban, but mostly, you know, you have a great variation in the different kinds of sites. Heather, Melton, you're on as well, and you're a statewide SAK site in a often more rural area of Utah. So it really, this provides an opportunity to see all these kits were tested at one time across the United States. And the sites are now coordinated and sharing information. And so we're really being able to see across the United States, what are some of the bigger pictures stuff, so that it isn't just about the traditional high crime urban areas where these kinds of things happening. What we're seeing is that a rapist in Cleveland is not actually all that different from the rapist in Kansas, even though those can be drastically different in many important and meaningful ways. But the rapists have some, I think we have some bigger takeaways for law enforcement and for researchers.
Hey, Rachel, can I interrupt you for just a second? Angela is actually, I think I can see her. She's listed as a telephone number now in the attendance. So if somebody could give her the ability to unmute, or maybe I can do it. No, I can't, but if
I allowed her.
Okay. Hi, Angela, can you hear us?
I can hear you all. Can you hear me?
Oh, yay! Yes, I'm glad we got that worked out. I'm sorry about that.
It wouldn't be a Zoom meeting without something going wrong. Good morning, everyone.
Thanks. So I think I had planned on doing this presentation, this slide, so I'll just let you take over from the others. Our first recommendation is really to consider that a rapist had done this before or will continue to in the future, or perhaps both. This really gives us the SAK initiative, and the data coming out from the initiative is giving us different information about recidivism. The reason why we're getting different information is because a lot of the stats based on recidivism rates for sexually based offenses are based on someone being arrested or convicted for something, and or then going to prison for something, and then going to prison again for another offense, and watching them over a short period of time. Those two things rely very heavily on the criminal justice system, and we know that rape is the most underreported violent crime, and very few individuals who rape actually end up going to prison for that offense. We also know about recidivism rates from self-reporting, which are really pretty high estimates from self-reporting, but again, self-reporting has some inherent issues with that. What's unique about the data here is that we're able to link cases through more objective means and without the prism of self-reporting. And the evidence was collected from the kit at the time that the kit was collected versus at the time of conviction. So we have a more representative view of reported rapes because we're getting that information at the time that the rape was reported and a victim got a sexual assault kit collected, not necessarily at conviction, which again, given the high rates of attrition with sexual assault, can be extremely problematic. Number two here, I think, is really looking at modus operandi. And Angela, I think you have this one, right?
I think you were going to do it, Rachel,
Okay.
but I can do it.
Go ahead. I've been talking a lot, so please.
Okay, yeah. So I think, one of the biggest myths was that an acquaintance rapist would only be an acquaintance rapist and stranger. And what we have seen under SAK from multiple jurisdictions, so not just urban areas, rural, across the board, is just really a mix in the MO. There's examples of people who will grab victims off the street, target people in their homes. So like really high risk behavior, and then acquaintance rapes all mixed in by the one person. And even victim preference. Sometimes it will be someone who may be a high risk victim with drugs, alcohol, prostitution involved, or it could just be a regular person who's sitting in a classroom after college. So just across the board, there's just really no set pattern of behavior for a lot of these offenders. And Rachel, I would like you to jump in with the Cuyahoga example, which I think is really good.
Yeah, sure. So we've written about some of these examples in the article we mentioned from Law Enforcement Bulletin, but we also have published on some of these examples. So one offender raped a 13-year-old juvenile stranger at a party. He was actually one of 4 offenders involved, and a multiple offender rape of an intoxicated 13-year-old juvenile. And then also several months later, raped his 3-year-old son. Both of those rapes were connected by DNA, but had it not been for the DNA, the offenses were so different that they probably wouldn't have connected the female juvenile stranger at the party to the rape of his own toddler son, because you know, you're crossing gender, you're crossing different age groups, and so on. There's also one we write about from Kansas where one offender is connected to 3 victims who are acquaintances, and then the 4th victim was an intimate partner who he kidnapped, strangled almost to the point of death, buried her alive, unburied her at some point, and then held her captive for an extended period of time. Those rapes are so different from each other in terms of their offending pattern that law enforcement probably wouldn't have been looking for the acquaintance one, even though he raped all of his intimate partner, because the intimate partner was reported and had DNA collected, then they was able to link to these other acquaintances, which really gets at the fact that it's really important for all rape kits to be tested, and also encourage victims and support victims in reporting the sexual assaults, because then you can see through intimate partners and acquaintances, you can see a much better picture of the full offending pattern of these individuals.
And the next point that we really want to make is do not rely solely on DNA to solve a case, which as a forensic DNA person, it kind of pains me to say this, but it is a reality. And so you got to be really mindful of that. DNA is great. And in terms of using CODIS, you'll get probably a 30 to 50% hit rate and leading to suspects. And then obviously with the use of forensic genetic genealogy, you're getting even more cases solved. But at the end of the day, we're probably seeing about 50% of the cases will be solved using DNA, which again is fantastic. But, you know, in some cases, there's insufficient DNA, there's no DNA, or even with CODIS and FGG, there's just no hit. So what else can you do? And that's why we partner with the FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program in late 2017. And now it's a formal requirement of SAK grants that not only are we making sure that you upload your profiles to CODIS, that you also enter your cases that meet the VICAP criteria into the VICAP database. And this is because it searches on MO. And so you have living victims in most of these cases who can tell you information about the suspect or their vehicle, what weapons they use, what language they use, even down to smells and things like that that can be really useful for linking cases together. And there was a great success story this year where it was 2 agencies in Texas had both entered cases into VICAP, and before DNA was ready in the cases, they were linked through VICAP. And that's the other point we really want to make. VICAP is not just for linking across jurisdiction state lines. I mean, you might be local, but you may not be the same agency. And VICAP can really help link cases quite easily for you if you put it in the system. And it takes about an hour or so to enter a case, but we do fund that under SAK as well. So point number 4 is do not assume that sexual offenders only commit sexual offenses. And actually what we're seeing under SAK is when we get CODIS hits, the majority of those hits involving serial offenders are to non-sexual violent offenses. So just to clarify, while we're finding a lot of serial sexual offenders, we're finding a lot who are convicted of homicides, kidnappings, armed robberies, just other violent offenses as well. So basically testing one kit could solve a multitude of cases and not just sexual assaults. Not that that's not important enough. So just think about how versatile and prolific that many of these offenders really are. Point number 5 is, yes, you have to be patient, understand the limitations of CODIS, and you need to verify that DNA from lawfully eligible suspects are in CODIS. So what does that mean? Don't assume that just because somebody was convicted of a crime in the past, or if your state has an all arrestee law, you can never assume that their DNA definitely made its way to CODIS. So that's something you really need to verify. I'll just wrap this up quickly because we're running out of time, but just one example, in Cuyahoga County alone, which is really just the Cleveland area, they have 16,000 samples from offenders who should be in CODIS that are missing. So that's something else to question in your jurisdiction.
I think here, one of the key takeaways is that DNA profiles really extend beyond the crime in question. And so that's why we need to test non-stranger rapes and stranger rapes, those outside the statute of limitations, those for cases for victims who wanted their kits to be tested but didn't necessarily want to prosecute. And so law enforcement may not be able to get justice for that particular victim, but they may be able to for past or future victims. So really being able to see beyond just this one incident and using the power of DNA and forensic evidence and VICAP to be able to link these is very important.
Yeah, and take-home message is testing of your kit and the evidence is just your first step. Think about everything else that's involved and it's equally as important. And that's what we really stress under SAK. Investigations, crimes, prosecutions, going beyond the kit is our theme and is critically important. Okay, and we'll leave it there and here's all of our contact information.
Awesome, thank you.
Is it my turn to try again?
Yes.
Okay, I think I figured out. I recorded over my just regular presentation. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna put it up, but it's gonna be in that kind of draft screen, because if I go back to, you know, start the whole thing, it's gonna have my recording. So I hope that's okay. And I'm clicking on share and it's not doing anything. Okay, can you see this?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so is that okay? I'm just gonna do it like this.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Whatever.
Okay. So I'm talking about previously unsubmitted sexual assault kits, lessons learned from Salt Lake County, which is one of the SAK sites. I'm Heather Melton. I'm an associate professor at University of Utah, and my co-author is Krystal Hazlett, who was the CCJJ SAK coordinator. And I have to begin by just acknowledging and dedicating this to Krystal Hazlett, who unexpectedly passed away in July. And this project, as well as all of the advances in the response to sexual assault in the state of Utah, would not have happened without her tireless work for this cause. She was a fierce advocate for victims of sexual assault, as well as reforming our response to sexual assault. And her legacy is going to be felt for years to come, and she is sorely missed. So I just wanted to acknowledge her. Here is the disclosure. It was supported by 2 grants, and that the points of views are of the authors and don't represent the official position of the policies of the U.S. Department of Justice. And then here's a little more information on those grants. You can see one ended in Salt Lake County. It was a pilot project that ended in 2019, and then a statewide project that ended in 2020. So, you know, I don't know if I need to do this, but I'm going to, because I always do, just to give you a little bit of background about what I'm talking about. So we're talking about sexual assault kits, which is the collection of evidence gathered from a sexual assault victim by a medical professional. That kit, that evidence then would be submitted to a crime lab. If there is eligible evidence within that kit, then that can then be uploaded into CODIS, which obviously we've already been talking about. So CODIS, of course, serves the purpose of allowing us to link cases to offenders or cases to cases. And you can have a CODIS hit occur in 2 ways. You can either have a DNA profile developed from evidence in the SAK that matches to an offender and arrestee, or you can have a case-to-case hit in which the unknown DNA profile matches an unknown DNA profile from another case. So I'm talking into the sexual assault kit. One of the things that came out, sexual assault kit initiative, one of the things that started coming out in the 2000s and 2010s was that all across the country, there were sexual assault kits that had not been ever submitted to a crime lab. So they had never been tested. So the Sexual Assault Kit Initiative from the Bureau of Justice Assistance is a grant program to try and address this. And as what was said, I mean, certainly part of it is testing the kits, but a big part of it is moving beyond that. What do we do with that information? How do we learn from that information? What happens with these kits once they've been tested? And so that's in part what the SAK projects have tried to address. So I'm going to be talking briefly about the Salt Lake County SAK project. And I do have to put a caveat on this. I'm trying to take a 2-hour presentation that Krystal and I were going to start doing and put it into 10 minutes. So bear with me, it's going to not be a lot of detail and just kind of barely scratch the surface of what we did in Salt Lake County. So my part, and I'm the researcher on the project, and my part, my goal was to evaluate the effectiveness of testing these sexual assault kits in Salt Lake County, including looking at the impact on cases, victims' experiences, and the overall process. And I want to I had 3 major parts, and I'm just going to briefly touch on each of them. But the first part of the project was to compile a database with information on the kits. I had information from 9 agencies. There were 11 agencies in the jurisdiction in Salt Lake County, but information on the CODIS hits, on victim offenders, on case circumstances, outcomes, et cetera. In the end, in Salt Lake County, we had 1,514 unsubmitted sexual assault kits that were found and then sent for testing. At the end of the grant, 1,411 had been tested. However, since then, I think all of them have been tested. But at that point, we had 549 CODIS profiles uploaded. So again, as was mentioned, you're not going to get eligible DNA in every kit you have. So in our case, it was 39% had eligible DNA that could be uploaded. We had 204 CODIS hits. So that's 37% of the CODIS eligible, or you could look at it as 14.5% overall. So I'm going to talk briefly about that. I also want to talk a little bit about victim notification process. And my data comes from a survey that I had victims and then those doing the notifications fill out after the notification occurred. And then lastly, I'm just going to talk briefly about some of the processes, one of the processes that was developed in this project. And it's based on a survey that was done in those, as well as interviews with key informants and focus groups. So hopefully you can see this because it looks really small on my screen. So just looking at the database, again, and there are tons of things I'm looking at, but I just want to summarize a few things. Looking at the characteristics of these previously unsubmitted sexual assault kits in Salt Lake County, the majority of our victims were white females with known offenders with offenses that took place in either their or the suspect's residence. Alcohol and drug use was prevalent, with almost 1/3 of the victims being passed out for some of the assault and almost 1/4 reporting taking drugs and alcohol unknowingly. Almost half of the reports documented force, coercion, the victim expressing that it was unwanted in some way, or fear, other violence in almost 1/4 of the cases, injury in almost 1/3, witnesses in almost 1/2, and offenders, when they were interviewed, were likely to say it was consensual. In fact, I think almost 100% of the offenders who admitted to sexual contact said it was consensual. Of the 204 CODIS hits, over 40% of those were serial sex offenders. Looking at case progression, so this is at the point when the kit was never submitted, what happened at that point, over 65% of those cases were closed. Reasons given in almost 50% of those cases had something to do with the victim, where they mentioned the victim was uncooperative or they couldn't locate the victim. And it was more likely to happen in the largest jurisdiction in Salt Lake County with older victims and with an unknown suspect. 35% of the cases were screened and 44% of those ended up in a charge. It was more likely for known suspects, cases outside the largest jurisdiction, younger victims, and non-white victims. And then post-testing outcomes, at the end of this grant, we had 26 cases filed. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that because I think one of the things we need to do is move beyond that as a measure of success. So I'll talk a little bit about that. And we expect that number to actually go up as time goes by, and it probably already has. Victim notification, I would argue, is one of the most important parts of the overall process, because how a victim is notified and their experiences with it will impact their well-being, their perceptions of the criminal justice system, and ultimately their willingness to participate in this instance and in the future. So we suggest that based on those surveys and interviews that the protocol remain flexible. However, scheduled in-person notification, including both a law enforcement officer and victim advocate, elicited the most positive physical and emotional responses from the victim. So that is what ultimately we suggested out of this project. And then lastly, as I said, one of the processes, I'm just talking about one of the processes developed, but it was the case review process that initially the idea was to do with all of these unsubmitted sexual assault kits. In the end, that didn't happen just in part because of time, but basically it was a multidisciplinary review of the cases. And it was viewed as overwhelmingly positive, in which different disciplines were brought together to share new information and potentially change decisions. It served the very important purpose. I think one of the most important things it served was as a training mechanism for all the different disciplines, but certainly to increase collaboration, to raise issues for policy and practice. A lot of issues came out of these case reviews that probably wouldn't have happened if these hadn't happened, as well as informing victim notification. And that was something that actually changed over the course of the project, kind of some of the ideas for how to inform victims, and came out of these case reviews. So in the end, I think some of the major lessons learned, I think one is an expanded definition of success. So move beyond just whether or not there was a court case. There were certainly some in the community who look at that 26 number and say, well, this wasn't successful. But I think it's really important that's not the measure of success, because so many other things came out of the project. One, testing of all kits. We're populating CODIS. We're making CODIS more effective and efficient just by doing that. Creating transparency and support for victims. As I said, I think that was one of the most important things that came out of this is creating this victim-centered response. And a number of the things that happened in Salt Lake County really work towards this. Again, the training issue, I think, is so important, that came out of all sorts of things, the specific trainings that were done, certainly, but then as well in those case reviews. And all of this has impacted future policy and practice, has already impacted how we respond to sexual assault today. Utah does have a mandate to test all kits now. And I think those are some very important things to come out of the SAK initiative in Salt Lake County. And there is my contact information. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So now I'm going to open it up for Q&A. You can ask in the Q&A feature. I don't see any questions yet. I just want to say how shocked I am at the number of unsolved or addressed cases. That was something that stood out to me. So thank you for all your important work on this panel. So I have a direct message. Let's see. Okay, just want to make sure the direct message was a question for everyone. The question is, why are so many individuals accused not providing samples?
This is for the ODNA one, do you think, the question?
I think.
Okay. I think, Angela, you can probably also speak to this, as well as Mary. Do you want to, Mary's the prosecutor on the, in Cuyahoga County. Since I spoke so much, do you want to speak about you know, why a lot of these individuals were not swabbed, or, you know, how they could be connected and arrested but not put into CODIS, or some of the things we found?
You want me to talk about this, Rachel?
Yes.
Okay. Why aren't they in CODIS? So at least in our jurisdiction, there was not a lot of attention on that portion of the statute. I mean, I've been a prosecutor for 13 years, and I wouldn't say we were dummies, you know, like we just didn't really know that we were supposed to be collecting all of these people's DNA. In the past, I think we all kind of knew we were supposed to collect their DNA upon conviction. And we kind of assumed at arrest, police were taking care of that. So we weren't, as prosecutors, too much concerned with making sure DNA was getting collected. And it wasn't until kind of we had this project, we were able to take a look at what was going on at the arrest level, because in 2011, Ohio became a swab upon arrest state. We realized they aren't getting swabbed consistently at arrest. And so we had to make some changes in the prosecutor's office to make sure we were getting some collections. And so the one big change we made was that we started working with the court that oversees all felony cases, and making sure that defendants, when they come in to get arraigned, their DNA is being collected by the sheriffs right then and there at arraignment. That's the only thing we have kind of control over. Because all felonies in our county, all felony indictments will come through our court. So my office, the prosecutor's office, only deals with felonies. So anytime we indict somebody, their DNA should be collected because they're being charged with a felony. But as Rachel and I kind of work forward on this case, we realize we're kind of only getting people, you know, if you think about a funnel, all the people that are getting arrested at their top, not everyone who's arrested for a felony is eventually getting indicted for a felony. So even with our new process, I suppose, we're not capturing everybody. It's better than it was before, because we're definitely swabbing a ton of people at arraignments. But we've been discussing ways, and with the new grant, our focus has been, although I would say COVID got in the way of us going into police departments and kind of seeing how they're doing things. But our focus now is trying to figure out what police agencies are doing a good job of this, what police agencies maybe have gaps or need training or assistance to get their swabbing up, because we want everyone that's arrested to be swabbed. That's where you can get the most swabs. And as Rachel described in our presentation, the more swabs you get, the more CODIS hits you get. And these CODIS hits are to significant crimes, right? It's no surprise that they're hitting mostly to sexual assault kits and things like robberies, because those are the crimes where DNA is collected. So if you get those swabs at arrest or at arraignment, you are going to solve more crimes.
Thank you. We have a more general question about SAK. Looking back at the cases, did you find gender differences between female and male officers in their treatment of victims? That's a good question.
Heather, you can probably speak to some of this as well. I can say that it's really hard in our cases to differentiate between that 99% of the victims of sexual assault are female in our sample. It's being that women are much more likely to be sexually assaulted, and those that are the ones that are most likely to get a sexual assault kit collected. So 99% of the victims in our sample are female. The ones that are male are primarily juveniles or kids, you know, children, or those that are males that are somehow institutionalized in a group home, in prison, something along those lines. And almost all the offenders, or almost all the officers, are male, or have traditionally been male. There are some examples, I think, though, at least in our sample, of female officers in the police department who may or may not be treating victims well. And I know that there's some high profile examples of female detectives who weren't necessarily treating female victims of sexual assault very well. I think overall, I think you don't see that differentiation between gender whenever you're looking at the victim of the sex of the victim, or the gender of the victim and the gender of the officer. I think it has much more to do with the approach and how they're trained and how they provide that empathy and sympathetic part, and that many male officers are able to articulate that. Many of the survivors are also saying that, you know, the gender of the officer mattered less to them. It didn't bother them that there was necessarily a male, but that it was how they approached them and how they talked to them. I think that makes a big difference. I don't know if others would agree with those statements.
I'm just going to give a 1 minute warning.
Okay.
The panel ends in 1 minute, just to let you know.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would totally agree with you, Rachel. I didn't necessarily code for gender of the officer. But one thing I'd certainly say in the stuff I did on victim notification, so this again is later, this is after the kid has been tested. As I said, I mean, we recommend that there's an officer there and a victim advocate. And that was something that victims mentioned is just, I think having the officer there sent the message to them that it was being taken seriously. So they saw that and they were much more positive about that than when it was just a victim advocate, even though obviously the victim advocate is there to be very supportive and to give them resources. So I think that was important. But yeah, I agree with you, Rachel.
Awesome. Well, that concludes our very first CrimCon panel. So thank you so much, panelists, for presenting. It was very interesting. And if anybody in the audience has additional follow-up questions, most of our panelists include their contact information, so feel free to reach out to them. And I am going to close this stream and reopen it for the next one. So if you want to watch the next panel, you'll have to re-sign on. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Sorry for the technical difficulties.
Oh, you're all good. No worries. Have a great day.
Thanks.
Bye.